Good afternoon, and thank you for attending our event. Welcome everyone to the second Paderanga-Varela Memorial Lecture. I'm Christine Alcantara. I'm a trade lawyer by profession. I'm Tony Abad's law partner. Sometimes we do trade law, but sometimes, our part-time job is actually hosting and showbiz. So just to make things a bit more lively because, it's in the afternoon and we try to keep things lively. And our topic for today is a serious matter. So before I start, I'm also a fellow for the Foundation for Economic Freedom, and I'd like to give a brief background of our organization. The Foundation for Economic Freedom is an organization whose purpose is to contribute to national development and continuous policy reform through research in policy sciences and related disciplines, and policy advocacy and constituency building. So FEF uses law and economics in the economic analysis of law and policy as its primary tool to advance economic and political liberty, good governance, secure and well-defined property rights, market-oriented reforms, and consumer protection. FEF counts among its members, well present mostly today, top economists, cabinet secretaries and undersecretaries, leading figures in the academe, respected columnists and opinion makers, and prominent members in the business and finance community, which I am very much proud to welcome today in today's event. FEF has for its board advisors former World Bank resident representative Mr. Thomas Allen, national scientist Dr. Raul Fabella, former finance secretary Mr. Ernest Yung, former prime minister Mr. Cesar E. Virata, and former socio-economic planning secretary Dr. Gerardo Sicat. And of course, we would be here today because without the founding partners whom we are commemorating today, Dr. Paderanga and Mr. Varela. FEF is currently led by its board of trustees composed of former finance secretary Sir Robert De Ocampo, OBS chairman, and former finance undersecretary Mr. Robert Bernardo as vice chairman. Political economist Mr. Calixto Chiquiamcos is FES president. Investment banker Mr. Eddie Gana as its treasurer, and lawyer attorney Ricardo Balatbat III as its corporate secretary. Other members of FEF Board of Trustees include Monetary Board member Dr. Felipe Medalla, who's here, investment bankers Dr. Von Montes and Mr. Simon Paterno, and our moderator for today, International Trade Law Advisor Attorney Anthony Nabad, corporate lawyer Attorney Perry Pe, urban land planning expert Dr. Arturo Corpuz, former Finance Undersecretary Dr. Maria Cecilia Soriano, and University President and Law Professor Dr. Joseph Angeles. It's actually quite a privilege that I'm a member of this organization and its chat thread. You wouldn't believe the the amount of discussion and intercourse also in the chat thread. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome and introduce, but I'm sure that he needs no further introduction. Wait, before. Sorry. Just one more before I introduce the president and we start the commencement of the activities also. Of course, a brief background, and this is our second memorial lecture, and I'd like to actually honor the presence of Miss Delia Paderanga, who's here today. And our first, because of the success of the first Paderanga-Varela Memorial Lecture, we had a second one this year hosted by FEF. And our topic for this year is national land policy, one of the advocacies of FEF. And also just to commemorate our FEF founding members, Dr. Cayetano Paderanga was the country's socio-economic planning secretary twice. He was also he was first the secretary under President Corazon Aquino and then under President Benigno Aquino from 2010 to 2012. And he was the founding chairman of FEF when it was established in 1996. Also, we're here to commemorate Mr. Francisco Varela, who was the Undersecretary for Finance and Administration of the Department of Education from 2010 to 2015. He was also one of the founding fellows of FEF and also served his term as its president. And for this memorial lecture, we chose the topic of National Land Use Act, primarily because the Philippines being a resource-rich country, the path to true economic development is proper allocation, utilization, management, and development of these resources. Because we wouldn't want to be Venezuela, even if we're a country rich in resources, we want to harness those utilities properly for us to achieve true economic growth. So I'll turn over the microphone to welcome everyone. President, Mr. Calixto Chiquianco.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second Paderanga-Varela Memorial Lecture. The Memorial Lecture is held in honor of two former trustees and co-founders of the Foundation for Economic Freedom, former Socio-Economic Planning Secretary Cayetano Paderanga Jr., or Don Don as we know him, and former investment banker and Department of Education Undersecretary Francis Varela. We have recognized already the widow of Don Don, Delia. Unfortunately, Ms. Rowena Varela has to pick up her kids from school and cannot be with us today. We certainly miss the presence of Don Don and Francis. Our first memorial lecture was held in October last year. The topic was, does ending ENDO contribute to inclusive economic growth? Our speaker then was Dr. Vicente Paqueo, UP Economics professor and former economist of the World Bank. For this second memorial lecture, we asked our trustee, Dr. Art Corpus, to talk about a national land use policy and what it means to the National Land Use Act. We feel that the topic is timely, relevant, and important. Land is a scarce resource. It is important economically and even emotionally. For those who own and don't own land, for those who use it as a home, a farm, or a factory, and for government, which, under the Regalian doctrine of our Constitution, owns all the lands outside of private ownership. The topic is timely because with strong, sustainable growth, there will be many varying demands on the scarce resource. It is also timely because Congress is deliberating on bills to pass a National Land Use Act. Therefore, the Foundation for Economic Freedom is proud to host this memorial lecture by one of its esteemed trustees and well-known urban planner. Dr. Art Corpus is a PhD in urban planning from Cornell University. He has been associated with Ayala Land for many years, but is also a well-known academician and distinguished urban planner. He has retired from Ayala Land and now works independently as a professional consultant. We're also pleased to have our discussants today, namely Assistant Secretary Merceditas Sombilla of the National Economic Development Authority, Environmental Planner Elmer Mercado, Board Advisor to the Subdivision and Housing Developers Association and prominent architect Jose de Guzman, and General Counsel to the Organization of Socialized and Economic Housing Developers Association, Attorney Christopher Ryan Tan. One of the core beliefs of the Foundation for Economic Freedom is secure and well-defined property rights, particularly in land. We believe that land should go to the highest and best use and should be an instrument to promote inclusive economic growth and higher productivity. Hence, we chose land policy as a topic of our memorial lecture today. We would like to thank all of those who have made this event possible, including sponsors and partners, namely our major sponsors, Aboitiz Power Corporation, Bank of the Philippine Islands, and Manila Electric Company. Our minor sponsors, Ayala Land, Convergence Realty and Development Corporation, or CONDEF, DMCI, Development Bank of the Philippines, Frederick Naumann Foundation in the Philippines, Manila Water Company, Organization of Socialized Housing Developers of the Philippines, or OSDHP, Philippine Veterans Bank, Philippine Chamber of Commerce Incorporated, ProFriends Group, Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation, and Stratcom Corporation. We'd also like to thank our donors, namely FINMA Properties Incorporated and Malate Construction and Development Corporation. We welcome your attendance and participation in this event. We hope you will be enlightened by the discussions and go home a little wiser today. We also would like to invite all of you to cocktails and fellowship after the event. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you for the welcome speech. And of course, I'd like to remind everyone this is a lecture and discussion. So your feedback, of course, in the profile of FEF, it says that a lot of you are opinionated. So we'd welcome those opinions later. Okay. So without further ado, let's go to the meat of the program, the speakers and the panel. So I'd like to introduce someone that I vaguely or more or less know. My law partner, attorney Anthony Abad. Tony is the CEO of Trade Advisors and a trustee of Foundation of Economic Freedom. He is a member of the Philippine Bar, has been in legal practice for over 25 years. Attorney Abad specializes in international trade and provides technical advice and assistance to multinational corporations and business enterprises, as well as international organizations, government, and academic institutions on matters of international trade policy, regulation, competition law and policy, and good governance. He has also served as a key expert on trade policy and export development for the EU-Philippines Trade-Related Technical Assistance Project, Phase 2 or TRTA-2. So he was formerly served in government as chairman of the Department of Agriculture Secretary's Technical Advisory Group, the president of the Philippine International Trading Corporation, administrator of the National Food Authority, and commissioner of the Tariff Commission. Currently, he sits at the Dispute Settlement Panel of the World Trade Organization. He also serves as an independent policy advisor to both houses of Congress on competition law and economic reform. He also hosts the show Political Capital, aired on Bloomberg TV Philippines, which I think airs Monday. He's a lecturer on international trade law at the Ateneo de Manila University Law School and director of the Ateneo Center of International Economic Law. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause for Tony.
I think that was too long an introduction for the moderator. In any case, so we'll jump into the, I think the heart of this discussion is really this trying to get into the whole discussion on the necessity of a land use, or the urgency and the necessity of a national land use policy. Now, before we proceed, let me give you at least a description of how we'll be having this discussion. We have a speaker and four discussants. Our speaker is going to speak for up to 30 minutes or less. And the discussants will have about 15 minutes or less to react to the presentation. After that, we will go into the discussion. I have a few questions to ask to get the ball rolling. But you have an app called Slido. Okay. And please join this app and put in this event code FEF 2017, and you can already plug in your questions. I'll be reading off Slido, but at the same time, I guess I'll be reading off the questions of Slido first, and then I'll open the floor for further discussion. No? And then that's when all hell will break loose. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce our noted speaker for this afternoon, who is going to talk about a topic that oftentimes, especially for us, we're advocating market economic reform. I think tend to neglect or take this topic for granted. No? But then, I think as our president has pointed out, there's actually a very important role that property integrity and property rights have in trying to build a true market economy. It's part of the shared resource of a society that if it does not have a system that is subject to integrity and transparency and reliability, then actually affects the ability of that economy and society to maintain a true free and economically free system, one that benefits all. No? So that is why it takes us to this topic of the national land use policy. Our speaker is an urban regional planner, now in private practice, but also providing plenty of policy advice. Let me read this. He is from the University of the Philippines with his baccalaureate degree in urban and regional planning, correct? And then he has his master's and doctoral degrees also in urban and regional planning from Cornell University, where he was a recipient of the American Planning Association's Most Outstanding Student Award, a SAGE graduate, fellowship, and a John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. He also served as lecturer at the Department of City and Regional Planning of the same university. He received an award from the Philippine Regulatory Commission as Most Outstanding Environmental Planner and from the University of the Philippines School of Urban and Regional Planning as the Most Outstanding Teacher. He is a former president of the Philippine Economic Society, a trustee of the Foundation for Economic Freedom, our very own Dr. Arturo Corpuz.
Thank you, Tony. I think that was also a little bit too long, especially since you only gave me 30 minutes. I'll start by giving you a status summary of the National Land Use Act. Then I'll provide my comments and recommendations. There are 4 general areas that I want to cover. Land use is so broad, so I won't be able to do justice to all the specific topics. So I'm just choosing several that I thought would give a flavor of the spectrum of land use. And then the last part, I'd like to give some recommendations on the strategies for the National Physical Framework Plan. Just to clarify, the National Land Use Act is not a plan. It's the act that enables the planning to take place and the structure to take place. So that's why the last part, I'll try to go into the plan itself. Okay, just as background, House Bill 5240 passed already. That was the National Land Use Act. Its objective is to have a national land use policy that shall end the degradation of the country's land resource. It was passed in March 24. Right now, as far as I know, there are 5 Senate bills that have been filed for the National Land Use Act. The one by Senator Antiveros is basically a copy of the House bill. Senators Villanueva and Subiris filed separately, but upon reading it, they're virtually the same. Then Senators Legarda and Hunasan have their own versions. Overall, I think there's really not much substantive difference among the bills that have been approved or filed in terms of the wording, content, and approach. There are differences, obviously, but as in my reading, substantially, it's quite minimal. It was certified a priority bill by President Duterte last July. So again, just some background of the scope of the land that we're talking about. Total land area of the country is 30 million hectares, and according to the Constitution, these are broken down into 4 categories. From the agricultural, that's where we get the alienable and disposal land, and basically there's almost a 50-50 split between A&D and non-A&D. Now, if you look at the land cover data, at least this is what was given to me by NAMRIA, 2.3% is built up. And agriculture and fishery accounts for about 43. Forest, pasture, and water bodies account for about 55. Out of this built-up land, Metro Manila accounts for 0.2%, just to give you some of the scale there. And the amount of land that has been converted amounts to 0.07%. And from this built-up land and the rest of the land resources, these are the typical zoning land uses used by the local government. So if you have a residential plot of land that's probably urban, it came from the built-up land inventory, alienable and disposable, and at one time it was agricultural. Okay, this is another way of expressing it. This is based on the data from NAMRIA. Shows you some historical movement, increase in the agricultural and fishery land, increase in the built-up land, but obviously this came from the forest and the grass and pasture areas of the country. Now, the first point I'd like to make is that the underlying philosophy of the current Land Use Act, I'm using the House Bill as a bench reference, is that land should be used based on what it is physically suitable for, and regardless of demand. So the idea is that the land suitability, the characteristics of a parcel of land should determine its land use, which therefore determines its land value. That's the underlying philosophy of how land use should take place. Unfortunately, the world often works differently, especially in built-up areas. In built-up areas, the land value determines what you put in it, which determines the characteristics. For example, when Ayala Avenue was still a runway, the land beside it is agricultural, suitable for agriculture. But the land values today will not allow you to make it into agriculture. No? It's a shame if you spend 500,000 per square meter or 600. I don't know what the current value is. So, in a way, the underlying philosophy has to be has to adapt to the market conditions. So, okay. Second, if you ignore demand, then you lose sight of the drivers of land use and the constraints. For example, low-income housing. The primary issue with low-income housing is low income. It's not the housing, because it's the affordability that makes it an issue. So it's the affordability of the family in terms of the value of the land, the house, and the location that determines the success of a low-income housing program. So if you think of the low-income housing in terms of supplying number of houses without thinking of affordability, of course, it's not going to succeed. Okay, another example is food security. If you just look at the suitability of the land, then you will say, okay, it is irrigable, so it should just be rice or agriculture or whatever. You lock up certain parcels of land because of the suitability, instead of focusing on raising productivity and farmers' income. So as Dr. Javier said, market is first, crop suitability is next, and that most of our programs have failed because we got our sequence of priorities wrong. If you follow this logic, then you also begin to look at what are the constraints to increasing productivity, and therefore you think about how you can encourage land consolidation, not necessarily ownership, in terms of improving the scale economy. So this is especially relevant since the average farm size now has dwindled to about 1.3 hectares, and that virtually almost all of the farms now are operated by households or individuals. So it also, by the way, the trend in Asia is consistent with the trend all over Asia, but because of increasing non-farm income, they expect average farm sizes to stabilize and maybe even increase. But that's for Asia as a whole, not for the Philippines. So this supply-side bias, it leads to the tendency to condemn the market, the land market, if it is not understood. For example, the demand for urban land leads to land conversion. Therefore, the demand for urban land is bad because you generally look at land conversion as a negative. Therefore, the high demand for urban land is very bad. But high demand leads to high density, which reduces the demand for urban land. Therefore, density can be good. So the intricacies of how we use land, especially when density comes in, changes popular perceptions depending on precisely how you utilize the land. I've used this example before, but just to briefly show you how the topmost image is Kowloon, about 50,000 persons per square kilometer. The lower image is the city of Manila at 40,000 persons per square kilometer. So Kowloon has a higher density. The urban area of Hong Kong is about 45,000 persons per square kilometer. The urban area of Metro Manila is about half of that. So Hong Kong, the urban area is much higher in density compared to Metro Manila. But if you look at the amount of open spaces, even if you look at the map itself, you can see so many parks already in the Kowloon area. That's because the densities are very high. The high densities allow you to have much more open spaces. So the density numbers are just numbers. It's the quality of the density that really matters. Of course, you need a lot of infrastructure to support this. The worst case is if you have very high densities and then you don't have the infrastructure, then you get the worst. And I suspect we're already approaching those limits. So the supply side approach is valid, but it should be balanced with explicit recognition of the demand. It leads to a better understanding of what drives land use. And for example, you then ask the right questions, which is how much agricultural land do we really need? Or how much settlement land do we really need? Because these are the main conflicting forces. It also, I think, leads you to think about how you can remove the limitations to more efficient use of land. The holding period, the area limit, the buyback options, property rights and titling friction, rent control. These are all elements that should be reviewed in order to towards increasing productivity. Okay, the second point I'd like to make is the dominance of protection as currently drafted. Basically, protection, meaning land should be protected for agriculture and forest, prevails over any other activity. All others are residual. Noticeable because the National Land Use Policy Council under that House bill, the members don't include trade, DOT, DOTR, DPWH, meaning these are the drivers of a lot of our development efforts. So it's as if DAR, DA, DNR will just control the supply of land, and whatever is given to the rest, they'll have to contend with it. Again, there's no sense of what do we really need. It's that let's protect what we can protect, and then bahala na kayo. If you look at the left image, the orange shade is the mountainous area, the 18% slope and up. That's protected. That's basically forest. The right image, the orangey shade, are the protected areas for agriculture. If you notice, they're almost a negative of each other. What is not protected for forest is protected for agriculture. So where do you go? Of course, you will be violating something if everything is protected. So I think there's nothing wrong with protecting the land, but you have to balance it with the requirements of growth. Otherwise, its growth will just go incrementally, or if you don't allow for it to happen, it will go underground, and it continues to happen. Or the other thing is the way you protect the land itself will be compromised. No? Restricting growth, especially in the large cities, can lead to more land conversion. That sometimes that's not as intuitive as it sounds, but we did a simulation before wherein you look at this is the distribution of the settlements. It's a rank size distribution, the largest, and these are the population by rank. No? So this is the red line is the baseline that we use. That represents the distribution of settlements throughout the country. Now, imagine, if you will, that if you say no more growth in Metro Manila. And that's a very popular notion. So what happens is that the curve, the slope declines, and growth takes place at the lower part of the graph, because you're restricting growth at the top, so it will go to the lower part. The other extreme is you say, let's not add any more settlements, and therefore the slope will increase, and more of the growth is biased towards the top. The actual trend is closer to that, to the latter, and this is what, and based on our, some of the numbers that we came up, the trend scenario means the built-up land will increase by 44% by 2040. But if you restrict the growth of the large cities, this will increase to 84%. And if you think about it, it's quite logical, because growth in larger cities can be accommodated in higher densities. Growth in smaller settlements will have to be lowered, more sprawling, because these services are not there. No? So if you want to protect, restrict land conversion, you have to allow it to grow, especially in the larger urban centers. That is what this is telling us. Sometimes it's hard to, it's not quite intuitive, but then if you think about it, it makes a lot more sense. So as far as protection is concerned, I just want to focus on maybe in the third bullet, that this is also not obvious in the way the House bill is drafted. I think infrastructure should be integral to production and protection. We just can't say protect everything and then don't build the infrastructure to channel the growth where we want it to take place. We also want to build redundancy into the regional routes and lifeline systems. That's part of the infrastructure program. Okay, the third part I'd like to talk about concerns the planning structure and bureaucracy. Right now, as the bill classifies land into these four areas: production, protection, settlements, and infrastructure. This is almost funny, because in the 1990s, when I came back, one of the first projects that I was engaged in was in the drafting of the National Physical Framework Plan. And we came up with these four categories. And in retrospect, I think that's wrong. So, it is applicable only at the national level. But what the bill is saying is, apply it all the way down. That doesn't make sense. It is supposed to be at a conceptual level. In the first place, they're not mutually exclusive. Infrastructure cuts across all of these categories. So, what you want to come up with is more specific classifications that can be aggregated so that it adds up to a national level inventory. That way you can monitor it and do analytics that can lead to better policies. It's amazing that nobody has questioned this more than 2 decades ago. No? And in fact, they even expanded its coverage. So, the second part of the structure that I want to point out is this is the hierarchy of plans. And again, this is circa 90s. I know because I was involved here. So you have national physical plans at the national down to the local level, sectoral plans, again from the national to local level, which translate to their own investment programs, budgets, etc. Now, the physical is separate from the sectoral. It's something like it coincides with the separating supply from demand. So I think that's we should integrate this already, because sectoral plans, meaning everything happens somewhere. You cannot think of putting up schools and that's a doesn't matter where we put it, you know. So whenever you come up with a sectoral plan, there should already be a physical or location aspect in mind. It has to be integrated. You can't separate them in reality. Secondly, there are too many plans being prepared. At one time, in a study with I was with Chat Marasan and Ben Carino, we estimated the number of plans at the provincial level. They were being asked to prepare 20 to 30 plans per term. So that's about 8 plans per year. You know, it's like every time a donor agency comes, they're asked to prepare a plan. No? Plan for the elderly, plan for children, plan for drug abuse, plan for, you know, everything. So, and these are planners. There are only about 2,400 planners licensed right now. Maybe half of that are actives, maybe 1/4 are remaining in the public sector. So you don't really have that much capacity. And thirdly, there's a lot of repetition within these plans. When you do a physical framework plan, you're looking at demographics, economic analysis, etc. When you do the sectoral plan, you do the same thing. So the point is really to, okay, the other point I want to make here is that there's a glaring absence of metro level plans. In my estimate, based on my reading of the metropolitan population of the country, this is as of last year, about 40% of the population are already residing in metropolitan areas in the country. And that's, I think, a conservative estimate because that was based on my assessment of metro plans last year. It has increased. So it has to be accommodated somewhere. So this is just to illustrate the larger scale beyond Metro Manila. This is, I don't know if you can see this. This is EDSA, no? If this is CALAX, and this is C6. Once they build this will be your new EDSA, because it will now frame the mega area. And it's already there because these are the density, this is a map showing the densities. The densities are already there, you're just catching up with the infrastructure. And this is the larger view which shows Pampanga to Batangas. So looking at it from the metro level, not once did I read any mention about a metropolitan analysis or plan in the House bill. So I think we should simplify, combine the sectoral and physical. Anyway, there's a lot of overlap. Integrate come up with mechanisms so that the local plans are integrated, and then increase the efficiency of the planning process, especially in terms of the data and transparency and the amount of the resources. It's very hard to get data from the government in terms of for planning analysis. So I think a lot more transparency will be helpful. Just another point about these comprehensive land use plans. There's only about 22% of the LGUs have an approved plan. And that's been for so long already. You know? So clearly there's something wrong in the way it's being required. And not only that, some of these plans are decades old. They haven't come up with new plans. No? I think the city of Manila is circa 1980s. It is also being used for rent seeking. Everything that you do, you'll have to negotiate in terms of your zoning, your land classification, parking, building heights. There's no standard or updated plan, so you're forced to negotiate each of these. So it's not very productive. Of course, this is not for all, no? But there are some glaring examples. So Okay, the last part is the lack of the national development directions in the House bill. As I said, it's not a plan, but it should come forth with policies and principles that shape or frame how the planning will take place. Many of the policies and principles listed there are outdated. It should be more forward-looking. For example, there's no recognition of the urban sector, no reference to competitiveness, innovation, technology. I read and reread the bill. The word competitiveness does not appear a single time. The word manufacturing does not appear at least once. Maybe the word market appears 3 times. And in all cases, it's in reference to a palengke, a place where so the word protection appears 93 times. So in 50 pages of the House bill, it's almost 2 words every page. That's how I think the mindset. So it should be revised. So the left shows you the principles or policies in the House bill. And again, I'm using it as a reference lang. I think we should simplify it. We should maintain the primacy of protection. Don't get me wrong. We should continue to protect the lands that we need to protect, but reconcile it and recognize that there's a demand side. Food security through domestic production and importation. Metropolitan level planning should be integrated. Long-term trends should be recognized. Maybe you can look at the PDP and the ambition plan as take-off points, because this is a long-term plan. Strategic geopolitical considerations should also be included. What do we do with Benham rice? Critical role of connectivity, ICT, Internet of Things, infrastructure, building the physical environment to harness human capital, innovation, competitiveness. These are all absent from from the current draft. Just I show you, in Indonesia, look at the top priority for them is responding to urbanization, and metropolitan plans are required for the large cities. In Malaysia, the strategy is concentrate the nation's scarce resources in a few priority urban areas with the greatest potential for job creation along key economic corridors. It is the policy of concentrated decentralization. In the 1990s, I had proposed in Tuneda the policy of national dispersal to regional concentration. That was back then, no? Because our thinking then was concentrate in the regional centers. By doing that, at the national level, you're actually dispersing, no? Because that was the idea. If you disperse everything from Metro Manila, it only strengthens Metro Manila. Okay, because you're dispersing it in a fragmented way. You have to disperse resources in some concentrated areas so they become strong enough to compete or to match the services. If you fragment it, you're only strengthening the capital region. In Thailand, it's similar priorities. In Vietnam, they're so obsessed with the demand. They even calculated 450,000 hectares for urban land, the average per capita land requirement of 85 square meters, etc. So this is how others are looking at their land use or land policies. We're very passive. Maybe when I read the bill, it's like it's saying, protect everything. If you have to grow, don't grow outside where you are now. So it's hard to. If you look at the objective of the National Land Use Bill, the objective is to stop land degradation. And then and then what? It doesn't give you a sense of where to go. I think that's what's lacking. Okay, the last part is, I said I'll mention 3 strategies that I think should be emphasized in the National Physical Framework Plan. Basic strategies. One is to make our cities and production areas work much more efficiently, build on the scale and agglomeration economies. In a recent book by Jeffrey West, he showed that as a city population doubles, productivity, wages, GDP, patents produced increases by 115%. So there's that 15% premium which could be attributed to scale and agglomeration. Translated differently, it's like increasing the amount of infrastructure by only 85% to account for the 100%. But these economies are also increasing by 115%. So the trick is to maximize the benefits and try to mitigate the negative impact. Secondly, the second strategic area is to connectivity. Especially maximizing connectivity within 1 to 2 hours, because this is where you get the biggest bang for your urban areas. Not just Metro Manila, I'm talking about regional corridors, from Digos, Davao to Tagum, Iligan, Cagayan de Oro to Tagoloan, or Karkar, Cebu, Danao, Naga, Ligao, Legazpi. There are several of these corridors that are really growing fast, and I think we should focus on connecting them. Okay, lastly, on sustainability and disaster risk. Protection, I already talked about that, but I just want to highlight that they need to plan with river basins as a basis. And I know Elmer, Secretary Yusek Mercado has been an advocate of this, and I agree completely. And then redundancy. This is the base map of the larger Metro Manila area based on the JICA inventory of studies projects. I think what we should work on is look at creating a new spine, a ladder type of form that provides redundancy to the region. This also already identifies the points where you can expand your urban areas, and therefore prioritizes where your protection and where your growth can take place. But the idea is part of that overall strategy is giving redundancy from a regional point of view. Okay, last is market shaping, and this is something that I discussed in other previous fora. It's shaping the market, so land use and the way sustainability is accepted evolves, increases significantly. I use the example here of smoking. Decades ago it was very common. Now it's very hard to find a place where you can smoke. When I was a kid, you'd see advertisements like this, like doctors smoke Camels more than any other cigarette. It's hard to. Or Santa Claus trying to, say, let's give cigarettes for Christmas. Or in courtship, wherein I don't know if you can see that what's written there. It says, blow in her face and she'll follow you anywhere. Parang manok I don't know, ganun ba yan? So he shaped it. But today, no, imagine tremendous changes in the way the market has been shaped. Market incentives, both moral, health, costs, etc. So the same thing I think can be done, in accepting natural infrastructure, for example, using natural erosion and sedimentation practices, detention ponds, native trees and vegetation for increasing the resilience of our landscapes. Or medium density housing. This, by the way, is a beautiful shot of a DMCI housing. In the Ambition 2040 survey, 92% said that they prefer to live in the city. But 70% prefer a big residential lot with a small house. So how can there's a mindset here that doesn't match. You have to encourage them to go to higher density. 65% want to own at least one car. Or the value of efficient and well-managed public spaces. We take that for granted, the tragedy of the commons type of situation. of course, now the NAIA is not part of the worst airport list. Supposedly, I saw some news item earlier, but it's how we manage and utilize our public spaces. I think that's a lot of room for us to improve. So essentially, this is my last slide: shaping the market so that we know where to go in terms of problems or disasters. Our products are designed. When you buy a condo, the first thing you ask is not where's the swimming pool? Is there a refuge area in case of a disaster? Or we build structures that are more resilient. And therefore, we accept sustainability and disaster risk reduction as social norms, basically. And I leave you with my favorite image of the fashion icon of my time. Thank you.
Few questions already cooking in my head. So now we go to the discussion, and I would like to introduce at this point the different discussants. But before that, I have to make special mention of a VIP who sneaked into the room. My brother, Congressman Arthur Yap, Chairman of the Economic Affairs Committee, who is going to help us with all the bills that FEF will be pushing. Thank you. And by the way, I received a question about the material. There is a card-shaped USB that's been included in your folders that will contain all the material that is presented this afternoon. If there's anything else that comes up by way of surprise during the discussion, we will send it to you if you request. So first of all, congratulations, Art, for that presentation and the work. Seems to be a lot that we still have to deal with. No? Mr. President, okay. All right. So now we go, and let me introduce our discussants who will give their comments or the reaction. They're given 15 minutes each to do this, okay? And don't worry, we can still go back and then sort of continue distilling the discussion in the open forum period. No? Please give your presentation. You can do it here in front or here at behind the podium. You have the 15 minutes. Then after that, please take a seat to join Art. And we will begin the discussion proper after that. So we have, as our discussants, Assistant Secretary and Director of Agriculture, Natural Resources and Environment Division or Department at the NEDA, National Economic Development Authority, Mercedita Mercy Sombilia. We have former Undersecretary for Field Operations and Environment and Program Development at DANR, Elmer Mercado. We have a board advisor and member of the board of Subdivision and Housing Development Association, Architect Jose de Guzman. Welcome, Architect. And we have, last but not the least, Attorney Christopher Ryan Tan, who is General Counsel and past Chairman of the Board of the Organization of Socialized and Economic Housing Developers of the Philippines. Welcome. Okay, let me call on Asek Mercy.
Thank you, Attorney Tony. Good afternoon to everyone. Let me first express my appreciation for the invitation to NEDA to be part of this memorial lecture. As you know, Secretary Paderanga was our former head in NEDA. During his term, area and spatial development planning were given prominence for development policy. In fact, when I was doing a Google search last night on spatial planning, his book on the special and urban dimensions of development in the Philippines popped up, co-authored with no other than my current secretary now, Secretary Pernia, Victorina Hermosa, and other associates. The topic of national land use policy is timely and deemed important, as already has been expressed by no other than by President Kim Chiang-ko, and primarily because the President in his last SONA really expressed urgency to address land use issues, particularly resolving issues on competing land uses. Towards this end is the need to harmonize existing land use policies and assessing the policy gaps. The passage of Land Use Act is once again being undertaken as a priority measure for consideration in the Executive Department as well as in Congress. In the past administration, the bill was passed on the third reading in the House, as had already been mentioned a while ago, but only as far as the first reading in the Senate. Most of the hurdles centered on provisions related to the conversion of agricultural lands for urban uses. Dr. Corpus, our resource speaker, perspective presentation highlights efficiency and market mechanisms and their impacts on land use and investment decisions. True that in many instances, demand influences the actual use of land rather than its suitability based on physical and geographic characteristics. This is a reality that we cannot ignore in planning exercises, lest we fall short in recognizing the social and economic dimensions of development. We have seen changing landscapes in many urbanizing areas where commercial and housing projects have become the nexus of land development and primary driver of human and economic activities. NEDA is in the same line of thinking with the resource person on how to achieve a balanced approach to promoting more efficient use of land. In the newly formulated Philippine Development Plan 2017-2022, we included a chapter on National Spatial Strategy, or the NSS, adopting the principles of agglomeration and connectivity to achieve sustainable and inclusive growth. I should mention that this chapter was based largely on the study prepared by our resource speaker. We deem the great potential of scales and agglomeration, in particular the development of cities and urban areas, not only as engines of growth, but as measures to maximize economic efficiency and minimize the negative impacts of increasing population. The role of infrastructure, both physical and digital, has been mentioned, has to be likewise emphasized to provide efficient connective networks of the sustainable urban and rural communities. Economic growth, by its very nature, generates unevenness by mere fact that economic activities tend to concentrate in space. Concentration facilitates specialization, trade, and scale economies, as seemingly spatially uneven and balanced growth that are taking place across different places. These pockets of growth have to converge to push national growth. The benefits of specialization have to spread to the outlying or lagging areas or regions to make opportunities equal across space. This convergence is facilitated by improving accessibility and mobility through efficient transport networks. It will also be facilitated by enhancing investments in human development and skills, among others. Protection of primary agricultural lands is central to the proposed House version of the NALUA, and I think all of us would tend to agree to this for food security reasons. But what are prime agricultural lands? Our resource speaker stresses the need to properly define prime agricultural lands in a way that it should balance the requirements of the demand side to achieve the inclusive growth that we all want. In a study by the Senate Economic Planning Office in 2014, it was indicated that the definition of prime agricultural lands should represent a socially acceptable minimum agricultural land requirement that would maintain a certain level of agricultural industry in a given economic or spatial context at a given point in time. With this definition, the rest of the land should then be made available for the requirements for other industrial purposes, uses, for meeting the housing backlogs, accelerating infrastructure development, and other economic activities. Let me cite some figures on the country's housing needs by way of giving example on the land pressure being experienced. In the Philippine Development Plan, the housing needs is projected to be around 6.8 million units for 2017-2022 period. The housing backlog as of December 2016 was estimated at 2.02 million houses. The land area needed to build these houses is huge, and the availability of suitable and affordable land has become increasingly difficult to find. Access to decent, affordable, and secure shelter are huge issues faced especially by rapidly urbanizing areas. In 2011, there were about 1.5 million informal settler families nationwide. About 39% of these ISFs, or 585,425, are in Metro Manila. And the number of these ISFs are also growing in Metro Cebu, Iloilo, Davao, and other cities. NEDA clearly articulated its position on the conversion of agricultural lands and the discussions on the NALUA bills. In particular, NEDA supported the non-conversion of prime agricultural lands, properly defined, and lands to be covered by comprehensive agrarian reform program. For other areas, land use conversion may be allowed when the land ceases to be economically feasible and sound for agricultural purposes, or when the locality has become urbanized and the land will have a greater economic value. For other uses, except those not subject, there are actually, however, lands that are subject to conversion, not subject to conversion, such as those under the Network of Protected Areas for Agricultural and Agro-Industrial Development, or the NPAAAD, and the Strategic Agriculture and Fisheries Development Zone, or the SAFDZs. But both ever needs to be revisited and updated. In the case of the SAFDZs, the issues are related to overlapping boundaries arising from unsettled boundary disputes among some local governments, which are brought about by the lack of cadastral maps. Another issue is the incentive for some LGUs to have the whole territory demarcated as SAFDZs, so that they could take advantage of being a priority for public funding. Updating of the NPAAD, on the other hand, is going to be started in 2018 with the approval of 3-year project of the Bureau of Soils and Water Management. It will cover initially four regions: Region 1, Region 2, the Central Luzon and the Calabar Zone, the extent of urbanization, land conversion, and the major developments are among the considerations for selecting these first four regions. BSWM noted that 30% of the identified growth centers in the network of settlements in regions 1, 2, 3, and 4A are identified on the National Spatial Strategy of the Philippine Development Plan. The remaining 70% will be continued from 2019 to 2021, and hopefully the updated NPAAD map of the country will be available by 2021. Protecting resources and promoting food production could also go hand in hand. There are technologies already that will allow us to do both protection and food production in an integrated manner using the principle of multiple use zoning. I have an example for marine protected areas, for example, wherein established a marine reserve can have a core sanctuary where zones for non-exploitive recreation and research can be identified, fishing using non-destructive methods, an area for fishing using non-fishing destructive method can be allocated, may be allowed, and a traditional used area or buffer zone in the outer areas of the marine reserve can also be designated. This allows balance of protection and sustainable fisheries production with the ecosystem-based approach. I'm sure that a similar multiple use zoning can be developed and land resources. If it's still not practiced, I think this could be also developed on terrestrial ecosystem. The need to increase farm productivity is highlighted by the fact that agricultural lands have been diminishing over the years. Based on the censuses of agriculture, the total area of farms or farm holdings in the country decreased from 9.97 million hectares in 1991 to about 9.67 million hectares in 2002 and to 7.16 million hectares in 2012. The PDP supports the need to improve AFF productivity, but within ecological limit. And I think the strategy in achieving this objective is most appropriate with the development and use of an integrated color-coded agricultural map to identify the comparative advantages of areas to produce specific commodities. Food security is still a paramount national agenda. Food security, however, includes physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet the dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. The comparative advantage of the country should be considered to determine food commodities we can produce, importing other food needs as warranted to ensure stable, possibly more affordable, available supply. The supporting strategies identified to raise productivity levels include acceleration of construction of disaster and climate resilient small-scale irrigation systems and retrofitting existing ones, facilitating the use of appropriate farm machinery, strengthening the AFF extension system, and pursuing an ecosystem approach to fisheries and farm production management. Land classification data also needs to be harmonized in terms of statistical and legal definitions for planning purposes. It may be noted that our land cover data is based on following: agri-fish, forest, grass barren, marsh water buildup. New land use classification, however, should then be reflected in the statistical systems. In relation to this, consistent with what has been raised in the presentation, the proposed 4 land use categories for planning, namely protection, production, settlement, and infrastructure, need not be legislated, as these are perceived to be general functional land uses which are difficult to translate into specific land use classification in the way they are being used in formulating the comprehensive land use plans in the local government units, and also to demarcate on the ground, and also their difficulty to get demarcated on the ground. Moreover, there are overlaps among these land use categories, example, the mineral production within NIPAS protected areas. Thank you.
Of course, in honoring our former NEDA Director General Don Paderanga, we have also former NEDA Director General in the room. No? Of course, you know that Philip Medalla is here, but recently joining us, Romy Neri. Thank you. Now, let me call on Elmer.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting us here and the opportunity to present. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Corpus for presenting a very lucid, succinct presentation of the issues that we confront and how we can move forward. I don't know how to present this presentation, whether it's an apology for the land use law, because I've been involved in this process since the 13th Congress, and I think I was probably the one has some sort of institutional memory on how this happened, because I've always been serving as a technical resource person, and as you know, the vagaries of political discussion in Congress is very difficult, both with political interest as well as very very firm mandates of laws that have not yet been amended. You know. So the way I would want to present this is on 3 levels, maybe as a complementary to what Art has already presented. This is not a bashing of the presentation, but more of as a complementation. Second, also as a contextualization of some of the issues that have been raised and probably some of the issues that have not been presented and probably the context why some of these provisions or some of the issues raised on the policy are presently now being contested or being challenged. No? And then third, finally, that just as a advance mea culpa, I'm not defending the law of the proposed bill. First, I would like to say that especially the last part and the second to the last part, a lot of the recommendations of Art are all also I support, and actually also the thing that we have presented and submitted to Congress. No? How it happened, why it's not there, it's a long story, it's a different lecture altogether. But first, this is what I would want to present on the course of the discussion. I'm sorry, which one do I push? This one? Forward, sorry. Now, I think Art has already presented this. No? The problem we have now is that we only have 30 million hectares. No? So when our forefathers came in, there were only probably less than 100,000. No? When some of the laws were presented, well, there was like 30 million. Now it's like 110 million. And we are talking of 2045, it's around 142 million. But the land there is still 30 million hectares. So that means we cannot reduce land, no matter how much we want to reclaim. It cannot be sufficient for all people, especially if we talk about it in the future. And I think that's what we're looking forward. So I agree, and definitely it's a finite resource and it has to be maximized, the best use for it to. But the thing that has to be considered, and I think this is what has been the discussion always, was that what is the best use for Filipinos, say 30 years from now, of the land that is very limited and too many competing interests. And I think that's where the dilemma of all of this policy is. The other problem really is that when you divide it, no, when yung kanilang presentation po ni Art and whatever has been in the official, is that it's always 50-50. But that has been the one that's been presented of the classification of our land, I think since 20 or even 30 years ago. When I was DNR Secretary, that was already the division of the land because our land was divided by law. So the law says that anything that is there, that is public land. Anything that is not disposed, it is a private land already. And that does not change at the moment because we have not actually come out with a new land classification of our land so that then we can release all those that are now, I mean, if you look at it, in public lands that are now actually residential or already settlements. Quezon City, Baguio are still public lands. Certain portions of Quezon City are still public lands. Most of Davao City is actually public lands. And it's not yet been released. So the thing here is really is that we are actually talking of public land that has not yet, that is been decades old and has had to be updated. And I think that's where Mama Mercer saying about the cadastral survey has to be updated, and everybody knows here, especially from the housing sector, that the survey of our cadastral has been very staggered and has to be updated with all the new technologies. And if you take a look at it, and that's a very big mess altogether. So that's one of the other questions. The other question really here is that even in public lands, the settlements are already present. And therefore, that has to be considered. So that means we're not only talking of 14.9 million. The next question, and I think this is one of the questions that are being raised, coming from the, say, for example, the vulnerable groups or marginalized sector, is that the ownership of the land or the access to the land. Even though that the land is 14.9 million that is alienable, not all of them, or more, if we're talking of the number of Filipinos, only very few have actually access to ownership of land. So if you take a look at some of the data or some of the things that are saying, some 10% of the families or own 90% of the country's total wealth, then what happens to the rest? And I think that's one of the things that was being sort of presented by some of the presentation, by some of the interest group in the Congress. And just to get you that, the other element, and this is where we agree totally, and I totally agree with Art, is the context of urbanization, the urban-rural divide. No, we cannot anymore take our eyes off the need to address the problems of urbanization. And it is happening not only in Metro Manila, but even in the secondary urban setting. Just to add on to what you're saying, Mers, the informal settlers are not only happening in the major metropolis, but already in the secondary urban, the Tagum cities, the Butuan cities, and all those that you listed in the 117 sub-regional centers. There are already informal settlers happening on the ground. And that will continue precisely because of limited access to, land, whether it's agricultural, residential. Now, why does the Congress want to come out with the national land use policy? I think it's very important to say that one of the limitations, or I don't know if it's a limit, the challenge is that because it is in the law, the Constitution says so, that we have to protect it for the common good. So land use policy is a mandate of the state to come up with. Meaning if we don't want to have a national, fine, but unfortunately our national constitution says, and by nature and by the conditions that we have, it is needed. The other countries have already prepared their land use policy a long time before. In our country, there is no single national land use policy. But later you will see, we have more than 30 land use related laws by themselves, smokestack. Meaning, walang kinalaman po yung IPRA dun sa mining. Just to give an example. And that's a land use related policy. So that's why the mess that we have here is that because previous to coming out with the singular policy, there have been previous laws. And these laws have been adopted by that national land use bill. So that means what you have now are all the laws that have been listed before now tried to be inputted because we have not yet amended it. So by law, or at least in the process of Congress, they want to add them also that they don't break mandates. Which, when we were arguing for, is that's the reason why you want to come out with a singular, to amend all of these, laws. And, very difficult to argue for politics if you're a technical person. So at the end of the day, the question really is what is the common good? Which is the best for the common good? Okay. Now, of course, Art says that the market is the best use, and some of our economists will say the best use of the land would be the market. And I agree, probably, mostly, especially a lot of this in the economic side, urban economics. But I think the best question, the thing that needs to be is that, and has been pointed, is that the marriage between market and the common good. And the result should be not only the best use of the land resources, but the sustainable use of the land. Because we're talking of the future, not today. Next. Now, I just wanted to use this because mas maganda po yung map ni Art, no? And you can clearly see, she presented the left and the right, but the middle is the sprawl. Now, some of the issues that were raised by some of the, NGOs, CARP, and everything else was because of land conversion. And we explained to them, the question is really not conversion. It's a question that we're raising is because of the sprawl. The physical sprawl needed to be able to address it. And that is where the penetration comes in. If you'll notice, some of the blue dots are already penetrating already in the uplands, and some of those that in the agriculture are also penetrating in that area. So that means there is a question of how do we control the sprawl. And in more recent thing, that in terms of development planning or land use planning is that, and what Art has said, density is a critical element to make it sustainable uses of land, especially of limited land. And that we have not yet maximized at the moment. And definitely in the National Land Use Law, it is not there because it's not yet been discussed. But just to give you another aspect of conversion, we've always been talking of agricultural conversion to commercial conversion, meaning to settlements, to commerce, or what have you. But take a look at this. This is Upper Marikina. This is based on satellite photos that we did for several projects that I've done. This is for Upper Marikina. This is area of Boso-Boso, Tayabasan, Antipolo, Tanay. This is the one that contributed to Ondoy because this is the main sub-watershed that flows down to Metro Manila. This was 2010. This was the late when we got 2002 land cover. This is 2012 land cover. This is the
forest land area. This one is the protected area. This is upland area. Most of the orange one are actually already agricultural. The red ones are actually residential. No? Of course, the residential have expanded, but what you notice here, this is where the protected area is, that they already lost the forest land. And this is the main watershed, meaning the source water of our area. When we did the computation, just to show you how much was charged, this was the causes of this deep conversion. What I'm just trying to say is that conversion to land conversion is not only happening in the agricultural sector, but also most actually in terms of large area in the upland area, the forest land. Deforestation per sub-watershed, some of them are settlement expansion, some of them are land conversion, so meaning former forest lands are now being converted to agricultural land, not necessarily by systematically, but even by people, ordinary people. This is also for Palawan, 2003-2010, the amount of forest cover they've lost is 79%. You know, wooded grassland, 30%. Grassland, 137,000 hectares in less than 7 years. And this is based on satellite photos. And this is 2010. We are now 2017. You know, again, Oriental Mindoro. Well, the Tamaraw is, we're talking here only of one area, which is basically Oriental, because this is where our project was. So dito lang po kung satellite photo. Similar scenario. False forest, 73, open forest, -61, open barren, 71%. These have all now been converted to either grassland or open to cropland. Agusan Sur, positive sila sa closed forest, but the wooded grassland, ang laki po na nawawala, even shrubs, which are all in the upland. And then perennial crop because of commercial land. Okay. Now in the end, a lot of this, so the question of conversion is not only for agriculture, but also for forest land. So that's the reason why when we look at climate, the vulnerable areas that we are having now are precisely because of all of this depletion of resources, where most of our vulnerable areas are in the uplands, down the middle, and everything else. So that's the reason why yung ating problema becomes in terms of climate. No? So resource depletions, and so on and so forth. No? And this is what we see precisely on the urban areas. This one, in terms of Bangahan, this is Tumana River. I know this because I live somewhere here, and Ondoy po yan. So the question really is that, where do people go? No? Aside from the problem of who owns the land, the one problem that is that government, which is the largest landowner, is an absentee landlord. All of these are public land. These are public land, kaya wala pong mapunta. And this is only in the urban area. I don't have a picture of forests in the upland, but you will already notice that a lot of the settlers in the upland, according to Forestry FMB, around 11 million people are in the upland. Okay. Another example, this is the Guban City. These are all public land, and these are all informal settlers. This is the main Pantal River, this is their CBD. Ecological biodiversity, or so on and so forth, that we need all over the country, so that all those that are not necessary can be released, because in the end, it is only the DNR can release public land for to be alienable and disposable. Wala din po masabi. Paulit-ulit po, 13 Congress, 14 Congress, 15 Congress, sabi nila, we will send. Sabi na, we were doing the forestry survey, we will give it to you. Hanggang ngayon po, binigyan na ng pondo and everything, hindi pa rin mapasabi, because you cannot proceed with the policy without actually determining what are the numbers that we're talking of, so that then you can properly identify and then impose or at least enforce the whatever is in the law. Next po. What's the economic cost? I'm just trying to give here dahil malapit nang maubos, kahit tinimer ko po akong sarili ko. No? So this one is cost of recovering biodiversity. So just to give you a flavor of what we are losing as well, aside from the urban side, on the forestry or ecosystem side, this is how much we will need just to recover what we need to recover, so that we are in place. Business as usual lang po from today. So just to recover what we are losing now, ito yung mga for some of the biodiversity losses. And then finally, I think, and this is something that has been raised now, in the end, question of all of the issues of corruption and conversion is a question of land governance. No? Our problem really is the land governance, both at the national level and the local level. At the national level, our problem is that outmoded na po lahat ang ating mga batas. as Art has been properly said. And this is very, very clear. Because we are all smokestack policy on land. No? Mining, hiwalay, IPRA, hiwalay, housing, udha, hiwalay, forestry, hiwalay, fisheries code, hiwalay, and so many things. We listed them all. Ito po lahat, starting from Public Land Act in 1936, which is still the same law that we are implementing for public land today. Now, just to give you a flavor of how long these different smokestack type of laws are, until this way, public estates, water codes, so on and so forth, and then other related lands, which includes Heritage Act, which is not necessary allocation, but also in terms of land use, in terms of what, climate change, DRR, and so on. Iilan lang po ito dun sa mga nilista namin. And that's the reason why you need a singular one. But all the ways are probably fighting all together. On the physical framework side of the governance, as sinabi na po niyan, but one thing that is not being said is these three categories. Ancestral land, public domain, private land. I don't want to expand the discussion here. Most of you have encountered problems with IPRA and IPs and everything. Will know what is the difference and what we're confronting. On the public domain side, complete policy, land ownership, user rights, and degradation. Similarly, on the land side, it's not only those on the land on the LGU side, because different land areas, whether coastal, municipal, or offshore, are also under different entities. Like for example, dito sa gitna po, LGU. Dito po, paglabas ka ng konti, tumawid ka doon sa may shoreline, DNR na ang kausap mo. Pag umakyat ka, DNR. Pag lumampas ka sa tubig, Coast Guard. Kung maglagay ka ng pantalan, PPA. Tapos pagka nagpatanggal ka ng tao dito, dahil lang sasabihin sa'yo ng LGU, hindi namin ang problema yung formal settler. Bakit? Kasi nasa public land sila. DNR dapat magpatanggal. Because the public land title holder or the landowner is DNR, the public. So what can you do? And DNR said, we don't have the manpower, so we ask the LGU. The LGU will not go because they constituency, di ba? The same for the uplands. So, yan lang po, sa pagkarami-rami na yan, just to see you on the coastal side, para lang, kasi baka sabihin nyo, land lang, may bias tayo, di ba? I give you water, may PNP, LGU, BIPAR, DOLE, Marina, and everything, so on and so forth, no? Picture na lang, then finally, the frameworks, no? Labo-labo po, and it's good that the NEDA has now adopted the agglomeration, the physical, because if you, hindi lang sinasabi ni Sir Art, is that the last time that we had an actual regional physical framework na merong mga talaga strategy was panahon pa ni FBR. After that, wala na po, di ba? You remember the Cagayan, Iligan Corridor before, that concept, the Calabar Zone, the Caraga, we're all part of FBR. From then, wala na po na bago, wala na po na dagdag. And that's not being translated effectively. Then just to give you a summary of why it is fractured, because sa taas po, NEDA, Non-Distant Committee, NEDA Physical Framework, regional. Pagdating na po sa probinsya, meaning who translates the policy, hindi na po NEDA. HLURB na. And HLURB only covers highly urbanized cities and provinces. That's why po, hindi magawa yung integrated metropolitan because HLURB mandates it. This is mandated by the local government code dahil HUs in the provinces are treated as individual entities altogether. Provinces, cities, municipalities are one, and they have no control because the one who controls the provinces, the cities, and supervises is what? Is it NEDA? No, it's not HLURB. It's the ILG. Forward planning, where the question of innovation is being looked at, how much are we looking forward to, where do we... So that's very difficult for us to be able to properly plan so that then we can maximize. We do not know ilan ba ang tinitignan natin or how far along so that then we can quantify. Second, the decisions for today, no, where the value adding also is the question of the distortion and how we can value add. Just to reiterate and complement, so add on po ito to what Art said. This is where the requirement for national land becomes because we need something that will provide the primacy of the land resource as a policy so that everybody will align, especially at the local government level. Ang problema po natin ngayon because they are all treated as individual fiefdoms or kingdoms, wala po silang sinusunod. Kanya-kanya pong sunod, so that's why the political maneuverings on the ground is all dictated by whoever are nakakausap mo. Without a sort of a general platform for them to be able to at least preliminarily identify what should be and should not be taken over, Yun po ang nag-ano dyan. So that's the reason why some of the elements there, and this is actually clearly the same with Art's presentation, is the needed protection of some of the areas, but has to be clearly defined which and where. No? So, doon lang po sa prime agricultural land, malaki na po ang debate, precisely because some of the question there is that, do we enter it because of food security? And at the moment, that is left to the decision of the local government unit, which is very difficult, both for the local government unit as well as for those who are there trying to engage. Because who can argue for food security? Pagka nagreklamo na po yung mga farmers doon at nagrally na sa politika, ito, patay na siya. On the other hand, sino naman ang magre-resist na pag pumasok yung Jollibee sa iyo o kaya ng Showmart o kaya ng even Ayala Land to convert your land? Di ba? Prestige, dahil ano ka na. No? In the provinces, in the rural areas, the marker for economic development is not this GDP growth. It is ilang Jollibee ba na dyan. Pag may city mall ka na at may SM ka, number 1 na ang ano mo. Di ba po? Lalo na pag Ayala. Dahil talagang and that's the mark of their economic growth and development. So that's really very difficult for them. Second, future land use. So sinabi ko na po yan, na tinatanong natin, the primacy of the land use, and then of course the planning. Yan lang po at hindi pala, sorry. This one just for just to complement. What is important is, aside from the policy is not enough. No, the law is not enough. We do not, even if we are able to fix some of the governance arrangement, the prioritization, the whatever, there's still a need to do some of the spade work needed to make it work really. One of them, of course, is the permanent forest land delineation, inventory assessment, so that then we can release the public lands that are not used, that are not able to be used for anything else because they're already settlements, or we can release more for agriculture so that then we can avoid them from coming or encroachment upward. The cadastral survey has been mentioned, the GIS is based national spatial system, because at the moment, even now, very difficult for people to identify where are their properties and which land, especially in the rural areas. Tatanungin po, asan ba ang boundary ng forest? Alin ba protected at unprotected? Wala pong nakikita doon sa linya Hindi po nakikita yung mapa lang, pero doon sa baba, wala pong nakikita doon. So this is something that needs to be done. And then of course, yung lagi namin pinupush is that part of the issue kasi on land is access, ownership, and tenure. We cannot address land use policy if we don't address the issue of tenure. So the question really is that part of the element here is that we have to either consolidate or integrate the land tenure system that we have, whether it is CLOA, EP, patents, or what, into a single titling system or even a single land administration system. So that then we'll have one only document and one data and information that we will refer to, so that if we're talking to somebody, we're not talking to anybody else, or somebody from IPRA will come again and sabi, oh no, there's already a claim there, di ba po? Pagka nagpunta kayo sa pag sinabi, meron na pong IPRA dyan. Hindi natin alam. But then again, those are things that needs to be done to support it. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. In behalf of the Subdivision and Housing Developers Association, I would like to thank the Foundation for Economic Freedom for inviting us during this lecture. Mr. Corpus reported that the total land area of the Philippines is 30 million hectares. 52% non-alienable and disposable, 48% alienable and disposable, and only 2.3% urban use. The residential area, commercial, industrial, institutional, tourism, and recreation may be divided into 6 parts, and likely at most residential would be 1/2 of 1% of the total land area of the Philippines. 2.3 hectares or 2.3% of total Philippine land area in actual urban use is really too small compared to the 43% for agricultural and fishery. This extreme disparity may be contributing largely to the limitation in our capability for more inclusive socio-economic growth. I say this because this is likewise reflected by the worsening housing backlog in the country, which has increased by 46% over the last 5 years, from 3.9 million in 2012 and today 5.7 million units. This is an average of 9.2% increase in backlog per year. The housing backlog of 5.7 million, in my calculation, will require only 47,500 hectares of land at an average of 120 units per hectare density. This is only 0.16% of total land area of the Philippines, and only 0.37% of total land area for agriculture and fishery. I agree with Mr. Corpus that land use policy worldwide determines land use based on the value of the land, which later on will establish characteristics and suitability, and not the other way around. I also agree that the primary issue of low-income housing is low income. Housing will be produced and made available in the market for those who can afford. For those who cannot afford, a subsidy is a necessary component program if we are to provide housing for all. Most of our agricultural programs have failed in the past due to wrong sequence of priorities. We must now realize the need to reinvent the wheel on agriculture by considering more innovative and higher technology concepts. HB 5240 is focused too much on protection, and all other uses are residual to protection. Furthermore, DAR, DA, and DNR control the supply of land. We also agree with protecting land use for forests and agriculture. However, Mr. Corpus has proposed this must be balanced by other land use requirements. We further agree that excessive protection will result in limited growth, encourage corruption, and irrational land conversion. Control of land use supply should not be limited to the agricultural or environmental sectors. To ensure the compliance of declaration of policies and principles of HB 5240, and I would like to quote, for the state to provide for a rational, holistic, and just allocation, utilization management of our country's land and water resources so that their use is consistent with principles of equity, social justice, environmental integrity, and sustainable development for common good. SHDA believes that participation of all stakeholders in the land use planning and decision-making process must be ensured. In this regard, it is proposed that the NALUA adopt a centerpiece program and main planning tool, the comprehensive land use planning process that will guide the future economic development of each LGU, incorporating adequate inter-LGU orientation and subject to the parameters set by the provincial, regional, and national physical framework plans. In addition to the recommendation of Mr. Corpus, SHDA would like to propose that the CLUP be undertaken as an advanced master planning process by an interagency planning committee of government with private sector participation within the LGU, reflecting the vision and aspirations of the people within the locality. The CLUP, as ratified by the provincial, regional, and national land use councils, will serve as a main guide to private developers and investors in selecting specific zones or areas for development of residential, commercial, institutional, and other types of projects, without having to resort anymore to land reclassification or land conversion. Finally, when a parcel of land is classified as residential in the approved comprehensive land use plan, the land use has been determined to be suitable for residential purpose and therefore will no longer be subject to the redundant process of land reclassification by the LGU or land conversion by the DAR. Furthermore, since all of the concerned government agencies are active participants in the CLUP Interagency Committee, with critical involvement of DENR, the land shall likewise no longer be subject to redundant issuance of environmental compliance certificates by the DENR, which means that land is not within a DJ or hazard zone or within dangerous distance from an earthquake fault. If adopted, this will fast-track housing production and improve our ability to catch up with the huge housing backlog in our country. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, President Toti, for inviting. And just to make good use of the time so that we have more time for open discussion, so I will try to limit my comments to the presentation of Dr. Art, although I am really tempted to give comments to the presentations of the other discussants, but we'll try to just make passing remarks on all of them. Okay, I come from the Organization of Socialized and Economic Housing Developers of the Philippines. We belong to the category of mass housing for the low-income segments of society. And chances are, one of the major issues that our organization face is access to land. And the restricted access to land makes our raw material, which is land, very expensive. And therefore, expensive lands would really find developers of our kind difficult to provide mass housing for the poor. On to the discussion. On the lecture of Dr. Art, I agree on most of what he presented. In fact, we've noted that the proposed National Land Use Act is close to 3 decades old advocacy of many groups. And the closest that it has reached to becoming law, I guess, is in 2013, thanks also to the active participation of Yusek Elmer. Unfortunately, it missed out a few, it missed out one more step on becoming law because of really very serious issues, which I would want to point out. In the 15th Congress, 16th and 17th Congress, we have seen that the proposed National Land Use Act is a priority bill. We have not seen this in the past. And I think the trend will be to make it priority, I think, in the next Congress. So whether or not it will be certified priority in the next administration or whether or not it makes it into law today, I think the question of FEF as to whether or not do we really need a National Land Use Act is something that we really have to answer today. From our organization, we're saying we are not objecting to a genuine National Land Use Act. But definitely we are objecting to a proposed National Land Use Act that masquerades into an extended comprehensive agrarian reform law. We're basically saying that in the bills that we have seen in 2013 and also even to the current draft or bill, the protective clause or protection clause on prime agricultural lands, which when you observe the definition, practically covers almost all agricultural lands. I think, Yusek Elmer, on this point, we do not have this disagreement because it's really problematic because, as earlier mentioned, under the Constitution, only agricultural lands can be further reclassified to residential, commercial, and institutional or industrial. Just few comments on the data presented. Basically, we are also we are confirming most of the data that was presented by Dr. Art. We just noted, however, in the built-up data, in the presentation, it's 2.3% of 30 million is considered built-up. When we try to examine what does built-up mean, it's basically a structure placed on land, mapped by the NAMRIA. All right. When we looked at the reference, it is as of 2010, and we tried to produce an update for this as of 2015. I think Mindanao and Visayas are already covered, but they're still doing the Luzon area. So we are expecting the 2.3%, which we found that in our records is 2.52%, to most likely to increase a little more than what was presented, but still small considering the total land area of the Philippines. Of course, we've noted the remarks of Yusek Elmer in terms of much of our public lands being currently occupied by residential settlements, but we are not actually sure on whether or not NAMRIA was able to capture that as part of their built-up. The data is just saying 2.3% or 2.52% of 30 million as built up. And my instinct is that it already covered those areas that used to be public lands but are now currently built up. But I also confirm the sad news that really many of our forest lands are beginning to be encroached by settlements, and that is a good reason for a policy on national land use. For our organization, we've been saying that in the declared policy, the highest and best use of the land should be given weight. Highest and best use based on how we understand it to be, meaning to say, if government restricts beneficial use of a particular land, definitely we don't see any value in that. And we don't know, and probably this is our strongest critic to the current bill, why the highest and best use principle is frowned at. Protection is emphasized. This goes well within the points raised about demand being the driver of land use. And in the discussion, we can probably have more on that. Another point that I'd like to raise for our discussion in the open forum is whether or not food self-sufficiency is still a valid point considering our vulnerabilities to natural disasters. The spirit of the bill says food security and food self-sufficiency. We have taken the position that we must indeed ensure food security, but whether or not food self-sufficiency is something that we really need to have a debate on, because not all soils can be suitable to the desired crops. Self-sufficiency, particularly on rice, is something that the spirit of the bill is trying to push. But not all lands are suitable for rice or corn production. We've noted that, and as the saying goes, the devil is in the details. We like the rationale for land use primarily because of what was pointed, that there is really a need for us to put a structure, process, and even some sense of order in how we plan our land uses. But the definitions, when you actually read the law, is so vague that it would really hurt vested rights. Particularly the definition of prime agricultural lands, which is a long enumeration of adjectives of lands. When you try to eliminate what is not included, practically there is none. All agricultural lands can be rationalized as a prime agri-land. We like the proposed National Land Use Act on defining the role of government and government instrumentalities with respect to regulation of land. I think that is clear to us that for a business organization, we want to simplify and have ease of doing business by talking to fewer government offices. And what was presented a while ago about the multi and even interlocking or overlapping jurisdiction should be resolved in a proposed National Land Use Act. But definitely we are putting into question the role of DAR in the new in a regime where we have a national land use policy, and how or to what extent its control over agricultural lands, which and I will emphasize it just to make a point, the only constitutionally classified land that we can reclassify, you have to go through DAR, when the best regulators, the local government units, have determined it for its best use. Maybe in the discussion, some of you would want to make a remark on that. I also would want to highlight that soils data, SAF-DZs and NAPAAD, again, are 3 decades old. Similarly, we wanted to find or receive updates on this one, because for a developer, it's easier for us to avoid areas that we clearly are no-touch zones. Architect Joe mentioned about the computation of how much land is needed to address current housing needs. Since I come from the housing sector, what was presented was 45,000. Our computation is not far in terms of when we presented in May 2015, in response to a question of the economic cluster of the cabinet at that time, how much land is needed for the total housing needs of 5.7 million at that time, we gave a range of 38,000 hectares to 72,000, depending on priorities of densities. Again, total land in the Philippines is 30 million. To solve homelessness, we needed 38,000 to 72,000 hectares. Then we actually asked the question, why are we having a moratorium on conversion? Final points, comment on the agricultural lands is actually decreasing. I just have to make a remark on that, because we also found data produced by World Bank that is actually beginning to recover. But our instinct is that it started to inch up on formerly public lands, now agricultural lands. And the land needed for addressing housing needs is huge. It's actually not that huge. We just need to be wise in trying to identify these lands. And on the common good versus market, I would also put on the table the debate on, before distributing wealth, probably we can consider creating wealth first before distributing. That's all. Thank you and good afternoon.
I can feel a lot of movement also in the room, wishing to ask questions and discussion. So I have a few items on Slido, okay, to get the ball rolling. But before that, I guess I wanted to start off with this question. It seems like a very daunting challenge. When FEF and other advocates for the free market advocate, through the help of Congressman Yap, bills and laws that sort of open up the opportunity for the market to work. So, for example, the Public Service Act amendment, and later on, when we start removing the restrictions on investment, we're hoping that when that happens, it's a one-time thing that allows the market itself to correct the imbalance and the problems that we see in the economy. So there's a market, sort of a market-driven or a market-motivated correction that will happen. But in this case, it's really about mandating, a wise and best use for the land, for a scarce resource, and it requires, in a sense, it requires us to really adhere to this law and to implement it over time. So it seems, and then when you see the pictures, the statistics, you look outside and you see Metro Manila, just seems that there's no hope at all. I mean, it's like, it looks like this is a completely lost cause. So I just wanted to ask, and maybe start with you, Art, and not to get us back into the same the long discussion. Is it what could give us a sense of hope, and a direction that maybe all of us can help out, so that it actually corrects itself. But truly, when you look at the Philippines, probably the worst manager of land in the world, no? So where do we begin, and what do we focus or zero in on if we have only a few steps to take?
Maybe Tony, just to clarify also, I think the land market is also different. It's like there's a monopoly side to the land market. So intervention in a way is part of it. It's monopolistic because land, no two parcels of land can occupy the same space. So each parcel is automatically a monopoly. In fact, even the elevation is a monopoly. So at least conceptually, that's why there's some intervention required. But nonetheless, the market is also trying to address some of this. I don't know if you've been noticing it. Because of the congestion, the lack of infrastructure, carrying capacities. That's why the small condo units are becoming more popular, because the market is responding. They're saying, you can't afford transportation, just stay here. So this only became possible, or this was fueled by the congestion. Now going on a more positive note, I think it's never too late to address some of these issues. Even land and water use, it can degrade, but they can recover faster than you might realize. One good example, for example, and this is in general, rivers. What's the name of the river in Stockholm? It's at one point it was called the river for developing, because if you drop a film canister, they said because of so many chemicals, it would be developed already. But about 10 years ago, the mayor was showing they were drinking the water from the river. In other words, physical resources can recover. It takes time, but it can happen. What's the problem is really the institutional component. Intergenerational informal settlers. That's you look at all over the rest of Asia, wala na yan. Even so, there's really something the fragmented nature of institutions is one example. But I think the National Land Use Act, if it can reconcile a lot of the inconsistencies, will be a good step. It's just that there are some major hurdles along the way.
So there could be actually a sort of market-driven correction, or
Yeah, I think so. It will always be there, but
if
you need
the right
to
policies in place.
Yeah, you need to enable, or especially in terms of the infrastructure requirements. I think that's quite visible.
Anyone else? Elmer?
I think the opportunity here in terms of, I'm putting myself, if I will implement it, assuming that it is, with all the, if you use Metro Manila as an example, it might be a hard way to do it, to be able to achieve what we want. But in the secondary cities, the Tagums, the Panabo City,
where you have a lot more flexibility than where the restrictions and challenges of of Metro Manila are still not around. Cebu is already almost becoming a Metro Manila because of its traffic and everything. Everybody now who goes to Cebu are actually cursing Cebu because it's following Metro Manila. Davao is almost on that road too. But if you go to the other secondary cities, these are where you, for example, where you need to actually apply a lot of these policies so that then they can be properly planned and guided. Many people have said that the planning in Metro Manila or the planning in the Philippines is organic. Parang tayo, parang Pilipino, flexible no? And that's something that you cannot do, especially if you want to achieve yung growth natin daw. It has to be to a certain degree deliberate and guided. And if we don't provide that guidance, then we cannot be able to give some perspective, follow what needs to be done. And I think the hope, for me, going around, is that these secondary cities are the ones that will provide that hope. If they are planned properly and their growth patterns are at least more or less follow a different path than what Metro Manila is doing, then what the Art has been saying about agglomeration and dispersion will happen. And I think where the PDP stands now, because of the National Spatial Strategy, is actually, together with the national line, will be a step forward, because then you can now use these instruments to be able to spur that development outside of Metro Manila. Because without this now, what will happen now, even if you have this economic growth pattern, then they will just be replicating Metro Manila. And I think that's the worst. In fact, when we do planning, the first thing that people say, the best example is that don't follow Metro Manila. So that's at least lesson learned, that don't follow.
Lost cause.
Maybe a better land use planner or some other Superman can do Metro Manila. But for secondary, for me, I'm very hopeful that will be something that can be done.
Okay. Before I go to questions, anyone have a message of hope? All right. Well, of course, I have a question I share actually with our president, and it's regarding federalism. And I think Art had brought up the concept of when you should actually be trying to create other centers of gravity within the country so that people gravitate towards those centers and not merely just sort of allowing Metro Manila to spread out. And I guess some will argue that federalism will actually help to create that, this sort of network of have newer cities where people will gravitate to. But won't it also make it more complicated to actually implement a unified, cohesive national land use plan? Art?
Yeah, I think it will tend to complicate it because now you'll have to contend with more than just one central figure. No? So, in fact, last month there was a conference, and there are many conferences on federalism now. I was asked to talk about how we might cut up the country into federal states if we were going to do that. And I had some kind of methodology involved technical, and my conclusion was that if you can limit it to 2, 3, or 4 at the most, then that's if you had to do it, that would be, because the more states you create, the greater the friction. So that's, but I guess the point, however, is that you don't need federalism to disperse. Okay. Because right now, historically, what has been happening through the decades is there's already dispersal. The top 25 cities of the country the share of the total population has shot up significantly. And the shares of the lower, smaller cities are going down. That means growth is going towards the large cities. So
but including Metro Manila?
No. Metro Manila, it's outside Metro Manila. In fact, some cities in Metro Manila have experienced negative growth.
Okay.
So it's the Bulacan, Pampanga, Batangas, Laguna that's growing much faster. So now you need to plan for that cohesively. But because it's now
Metro Manila as a functional unit is almost irrelevant.
Very candidly, at least naipasa up to third reading, no, yung House bill. But candidly speaking also, it's worrisome when I listen to the majority of the opinions of our experts here on the panel that it won't really solve much because masyadong binigay na priority sa protection and without taking into consideration the use and the demand. So it doesn't make us feel any more confident that the Senate version seems to be just a copy of the House version. So even if it is a priority of the administration and it gets passed, it's not really going to solve anything. Ito, di ba? I can see you all nodding. So I also heard that there are about 30 laws involving land. And kumbaga the laws are not talking to each other. They're not related. So if we try not to solve all the problems of the world in one day or in one law, out of those 30, can any one of you cite just maybe 1, 2, or 3 laws that can be amended that can significantly do something, at least to write us, if not totally, at least significantly write us to a certain way that will get a fighting chance that if you cannot pass it in the 17th Congress, at least we have done something in this Congress. Maybe not pass the penultimate land use policy law, but at least at least pass 1, 2, or 3 that can significantly at least affect and put us on the right track. I don't know what's so magical about that 30, because yesterday I was having a technical working group naman on water policy, and there are 30 agencies that deal with water. And then now here, 30 laws that are dysfunctional to each other. So I hope can we get...
Yeah, I think the one that pops up in my mind right away is the CARP, one that affects the... Because I think Oti also shares this, the agricultural sector is really something that needs to be improved. It cuts across a lot of the development objectives, from urban to rural, improving productivity and removing the restrictions of CARP, I think would go a long way. But if I may also say that another approach, rather than focusing on the 30, is to come up with a bill that follows essentially what we want, with the features that we want, and then let it amend automatically what is to be amended. In other words, let us not be obsessed with trying to reconcile and fix one bill at a time. Let's try to identify what we want to happen and let it, by passing it, let it amend what will be amended. And therefore, it's you cut through that maze. So, Elroy, I know you have on the bills and laws mentioned, you might want to add.
If you're talking of course, the land use bill is still the best one, especially with all of these contending laws. The problem with all of these 30 laws is that they have their own mandates and they have their own sort of, sarang sabihin natin, territory to control. And I think what you can do, Mr. Congressman, is that once the bill is passed, it's still going to be a bicameral. The thing that's not present, and that's what Art has pinpointed, is that so many of the laws that are being, and the policies that are included in the national land use are basically reiteration of all the other previous laws. So that means what you can cap out there is that any of the laws that are in conflict with this are automatically amended. Like for example, let me cite an example in terms of the protection policy. The protection there, when we were pushing this for Congress in terms of the protection, just to give you a flavor of how the debate was that we were telling FMD, and I'm from DNR, to disabuse the term critical watersheds. So what is a critical watershed?
To them, a critical watershed is based on slope and the condition of the forest. Meaning if it is depleted and everything, it's a critical watershed. And you have to protect it. But in the case of communities, a critical watershed is the one that provides them water. It doesn't fall under. It contributes to flooding, that's critical. But in the law or in the current way it's defined by forestry law, PD 705, it does not consider that critical. Meaning from the community or the users, or as what part said, depending on the demand of the community, if it is critical, then it's critical. Meaning, and that can be defined locally. It's just that what we wanted to provide in the protection is that the ability of the local government to define what is critical for them and put it in their local land use plan. But at least the provision of them to be able to define it is there so that then they can use it when they apply law. Does not mean everything can be critical. It depends on still the local government units or the communities who will define on their own local land use plan, not on the national law, but the national policy will provide such ability to be able to define such. The same for agriculture or prime agricultural land. Which one you want to use for food security? You can use for food security probably some of the upland areas because there are Benguet and commercial. It's high priority, high value crops. Bukidnon has its own, and they're still using it for food, whether it's root crops or something. So that's one. So for that, I think you have to. But putting that aside, what other law or a single well, you're shooting for the moon, shoot for the Constitution. Because you're pushing already for the amendment, and then why amend some certain provision of the Constitution? That's restricted. You're talking of land, the land classification of the one that inhibits all of the land policies on the legislative side is the way we define public land under the Constitution. It defines this under 4 categories: mineral land, forest land, agricultural, and natural parks. And that actually covers the whole country. So if you want to expand the context of how we are able to, then you can actually expand or minimize or temper the way it is defined, what are all of those, so that then you can release some other, because all the other laws will follow, because the very basis of all of these standard laws are actually in the Constitution. Then if you're just looking for one single legislation that is existing, aside from CART law, and that's my take is Public Land Act, which is 1936, we have studied it to death, and there are so many laws that because it covers agricultural land, reclamation, and all other types of lands that are within the public. In the end, what we're talking of is to amend the ownership structure of land under government. The problem is that we are still under a regalian doctrine. The government and the state still owns all of the lands of our country. The Public Land Act implements what is the provision of the law. And if you cover the Public Land Act and amend certain limitations that are imposed under the Public Land Act, then you'll probably be able to open up. That includes the agricultural land for free patents, some of the homesteads, some of the reclamation, and even from agrarian reform, because some of those that are even in Public Land Act is actually agrarian reform is anak po yung agrarian reform ng Public Land Act. So once you're able to modernize, I don't want to use modernize, but at least to make it updated, whatever you want, then that's one, because that's a 1936 law. So I don't think anyone here, anybody here has been born in 1936. So that means those who proposed the law are not really correct.
Wala ba? Philip, you were born in 1936? Wait, I just wanted to make note of a comment by our fellow trustee, Bong Montes, that an interesting fact, Don Paderanga actually did urban policy studies at Stanford and published research on spatial and urban dimensions of economic development together with Ernie Pernia, who's sitting now at NEDA. So,
yeah, just I thought of 3 laws, very practical, Congressman, that I think we can look at. With regard to land use regulation, it's HLURB that has the technical capability to do that. But we've pointed out to the senators. Belatedly, we have not pointed it out to Congress, but the budget for housing and particularly on HLURB
has been slashed by 70%. I think for this year it's 15 billion. The proposal was to reduce it to 4.7 billion, which is merely for maintenance and operations of only this these units. Why is this important for land use? The only agency that capacitates the local government units to do their function is HLURB, and they have no budget enough to be able to do their work. So Congressman, baka we can actually appeal to you, especially in the PICAM, on the budget for HLURB. That's one. Second is the Forestry Limit Act, which from 1987 Constitution, a mandate that is given to Congress to delimit the forestry limits of the country. Until now, we still have not seen that coming to law. So that actually solves the problem of public lands being occupied or being used in ways that are not supposed to be used, that we haven't seen, sir.
Thank you. Just back of the envelope computation, if you want to know how much rice land we need, kung extreme na extreme, hindi security, kung self-sufficiency, maybe 3 million hectares for rice lands. Yun lang ang kailangan, hindi 4. But that's extreme, food self-sufficiency yun. Kung food security lang, less pa.
By the way, we like your comment, Ryan, on that. It's not food self-sufficiency, it's food security. So if we're more pragmatic and import our food needs instead of insisting on planting to rice, then we'll actually be freeing up more. Yeah. Okay. And well, Congressman, this HLURB doesn't deal with human rights, no? So we can increase the budget there. Okay. Philip Medalla.
Well, I agree that land is scarce and fixed supply, but there's something even scarcer and more problematic than supply of land. It's the supply of enforcement. It's actually not just fixed, it's diminishing. Okay, if something is getting scarcer and scarcer, it's the ability to enforce. Okay, I'll give you 3 examples. UP, which is a police force, 80 hectares of the 500 hectares of UP is squatted on. Okay, if you go to the agriculture, at the back of it, everything is squatted on. Okay, the back of that, everything is squatted on. So my point is, if you cannot enforce, the more you put on the plate, the more in trouble you are. So remember, the scarcest. Okay, my other point is, before you read Adam Smith, read Thomas Hobbes. Leviathan. But that explains why President Duterte is popular. Because when life is nasty, brutal, and short, and you have chaos, who the hell is going to solve the chaos? And if people think it's you can use any language you want, you will be popular. Okay, so this is my point, remember, that is the scarcest resource of all, the ability to enforce. So the more comprehensive the land use policy, the more you put on the plate, the more you will pay. So therefore, my recommendation is identify the key problems that you want to solve and you think you can solve. Focus attention there. What will that be? In a country that may police force na IUP, hindi po na-enforce eh. By the way, if you want to destroy anybody's career, make him Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, Community Affairs of UP. He'll be a massive failure, no matter how good he is. So my point is, you have to pick your battles. Okay, and my suggestion is this. By the way, food security is one of the worst. Because you can import food. So what matters of life and death? Flooding, water supply, and where the hell will you build your infrastructure? The thing is, by the way, we should have helped the poor have fewer babies to begin with. But now that we failed to do that, the enforcement problem became even worse. Can you imagine jailing all these people for occupying public land? We will not have enough jails. So the threat to jail them doesn't work. So I think what we have to agree on is what are the priorities. And to me, priority would be anything that is life-threatening, anything that has to do with flooding, anything that will prevent movement of people and goods. And focus on those things. Okay, so of course the question is, okay, so clearly you identify the areas that should have no people, right? Of course the question is, if they're already there, can you get them out? The best example is, maybe we should not have jeepneys anymore. See how easy the problem is? So my point is, because ability to enforce is the shortest, is the scarcest resource of all, decide. And my fear about this Land Use Act and so on and so forth is, again, we're thinking so big, we will not be able to do anything. So what are our priorities? And this is where we have to sit down together. Ano yung mga lupa na dapat walang tao? Kahit yun, alagay ko, let's say you say X, Y, C, swerte ka kung nagawa mo X eh, di ba? Dapat na away yan, ano? So precisely, we have to agree on what are the most important things. And the limited enforcement ability that we have, focus on those things. And of course, we must pay taxes so we can pay the enforcer high enough so he will enforce it. Okay, again, a UP example, Arboretum. So we send our police force there, they are the ones that get arrested. Because the squatters are former current policemen and are army men. The better are the UP police. So in the UP, when the police hears a shot, they run the opposite direction. You know? So these are all the practical things in life that we have to look at. I don't know. Have you seen the movie Urban Cowboy? What was the favorite line of Jack Palance when he asked Billy Crystal? He said, "Think only of one thing." You remember the character? Of course, you never find out what the one thing was because he dies before the game. So to me, that is what I think what the FPF can contribute. And I think this explains why President Duterte is so popular. Because he probably read Leviathan. Okay? This is what's missing, the ability to get rid of chaos. But if you try to get rid of chaos everywhere, you will fail. You do not have enough resources.
Good question. Okay. Let me pluck a question from here. Quick one. Which is better, a bad land use law or just maintaining the status quo? Anyone? In other words, as is, or wag na, or
At least alam na natin kung paano.
you have a lot of comments on the existing bill. Would you say if we push that particular bill as it is without any corrections, it would be actually make things worse?
It's not much of a difference, but what's probably worse is people will think it's different. So then, expectations are created. I think that's why I think there's just a few key areas that need work.
How about Mercy? What do you think? You're official pala.
Ang lagi namin binabato is always that. Are you happy with what we have now? No, but the thing there is that, of course, obviously a lot of the provisions that were proposed, there's always a lot of question. In any law, hindi mo pula perfect. And I think anyone who proposes a bill as complicated as this one, definitely will not be able to satisfy everyone. But from where we are now, and from what is trying to do, there are certain elements that, like for example, some of the implementing arrangement that needs to be addressed, especially in terms of the local level, are being corrected. Some of the prioritization, even the conflicts on how to resolve the question between e-programa mining or from MGB can be facilitated and resolved rather than just doing it by law. So those are elements that actually are being addressed. Evidently, some of the policies, like for example, that there are not a lot with regards to determination of which final ones, those are something that still needs to be amended. So, but from where we are starting, where we're coming from, and if you imagine this happening in the next 20 years of where we are now, and happening all over all other areas in the country without a more rational way of doing this, then you're probably having Metro Manila's in 10 or 10, 13 or 10 more cities in the country, which you have now having difficulty to resolve. Yes.
On second thought, I would rather that feel strongly that it should not be passed as it is, because it's like a lot of outdated things. Suddenly, we're reaffirming that they're okay. Mas mabuti pang pabayaan natin, we can say they're outdated. But when we reaffirm them now, then that's worse.
Okay.
That's worse.
Okay, worse. So we'll keep that in mind. Okay, with one last question.
Sorry, I don't have the Slido, so I'll just
That's
ask
okay.
the old-fashioned way.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to know what incentives can be created to encourage the LGUs to do the comprehensive land use plans. Obviously, one is access to technical assistance, but what can be, like, if we were going to set up a fund, or if we're going to set up some kind of support to give them that technical assistance, you know, through HLURB or something like that, but what's their incentive to actually get to do the CLUP? I think it's extremely concerning that only 22% of the LGUs in the country have a CLUP. I mean, the fact that Manila decades that don't have it, Cebu decades not having it, that's a major problem. What incentives, maybe from international examples, tax breaks, you can't access your ERA, I don't know, what's the carrot and stick about the CLUP?
Ryan?
I'm not quite sure, but I think in many of the discussions within the housing agencies, particularly the land use professionals of HLURB, there is an effort to actually include it in the seal of good governance of LGUs if they're able to complete their land use plan. Plus, they have that program Zero Backlog, but I think after the term of the former commissioner, it's still not zero backlog. So, yeah. So that means it's tied up to their era, but I guess the political interests and other business interests will have to have some stake there. Okay.
Just to give you the practical one, LGUs, those that I encountered recently, business, private sector. Once you want to invest in an area, ask for their updated land use. And tell them you're not going to invest if they don't have an updated land use and their zoning is not updated. Meaning, on the other side, because business finds that their land use is outdated, they can actually, manipulate it to their advantage. Meaning, just to be frank, So that's why you have all of this spot zoning that's happening in all this land conversion that are complaining, precisely because it's outdated. than any other new development, especially from business interests. It's very, very much an incentive to them to change it, even though it's not consistent. But if business or private sector investment comes in there and asks, where is your updated land use and how is the zoning arranged and all of this so and so, so that then they'll be able to put that and update it. Because if they have no updated land use, then don't do business with that. Because that's the only way, because all of the type of technical assistance, budget has been provided on the government side. The demand side, where market comes in, which I think will be more effective, is where you can come in, so that then you can pressure, be able to operate.
Architect?
Yeah. Well, to respond to the Congressman Yap's question, you know, in our association, our legal study, legal opinion of our legal counsel is that the land conversion authority of DAR has expired together with the carp and carpet expiration. This is now a gray area. It's going to be a very substantial improvement for developers not to go into the land conversion of DAR anymore if the CLUP of the local government says it's already residential. And that is why we look at well, there is an executive order by President FDR on the comprehensive land use. I don't remember the number, but I don't know if it's a law, but if that becomes dominant practice, this is also enshrined in the local government code, which is current. But unfortunately, local governments or local government units are not given enough incentives to update or even prepare initially their comprehensive land use plans. Also to update will cost money, and they may not have the budget. And in many other cases, they have more incentive to do this on a very piecemeal, case-to-case basis, because they deal with investors, private interests, and that's where we say corruption comes in. And so, if you're asking for, I don't know if that is just strengthening the local government code, particularly in the area of the CLUP, or picking up the executive order of President Ramos, putting that together, strengthening it, and I would say if we, aside from incentives, I think a very strong sanction or penalty if we can provide a strong enough penalty for local government units for those who do not update their CLUPs, then I think we will go a long way in improving land use and access to land for urban uses, housing, and others.
Thank you, Architect. Mercy, you have the last word.
Well, what can I say? I think that in the Philippine Development Plan, there are several laws that are included there. Many of them, relate to land use, and I think those laws were very closely deliberated on by not only the government offices but also NGOs, private sector. And so, which means to say that there are ways by which we can really, amend some of these laws that could really probably take the place of, the National Land Use Bill, if that still needs to be really revised and to be closely discussed, deliberated on, considering so many issues already are coming up with regards to how, how it does not really, respond to what we really need. And what's this? Clubs. I think one of the reasons why some clubs are still not very well, some clubs are either outdated, some local government units have those clubs, but they're not really well prepared. I think one of the problems would be the technical aspects, the technical skills of this. Projects, of course, private sector coming in and demanding those, would really one way by which we could facilitate that. The People Survival Fund, for example, which is now available for local governments to access. One of the conditions there is really for an updated groups. And indeed, some of the local government units that really wants to access this fund are really forced to really update those groups. So these kinds of incentives wherein, they can really, get some financing for certain projects. They can have some, financing for business, development in their place, would really provide that. But, to what number of this agency, of these local governments we can do that, to what extent we can really push that. But I think the biggest hurdle really is the technical capacities of local governments to be doing those. Even just project development, developing feasibility studies, they really need skilled people to do it. To the extent that the People Survival Fund, we're already trying to partner with SUCs, state colleges, and universities to really help the local government units to develop the project themselves. So I think there are ways, there are measures, there are interventions that are now open and are now more, I think, available, and the government are now, more responsive to wherein, we can really provide some push to, the direction that we want, to the growth that we want. Connectivity, is a bedrock, is a foundation strategy in the PDP. Connecting, farm to market roads, connecting, areas either by roads, by bridges, improving the transport networks, providing the import facilities, are all now in the government menu for, to be hopefully to be implemented, in this administration. And I think with greater connectivity, we can probably facilitate the inclusive growth, sustainable growth that that we all want to have.
Thank you. Well said, Mercy. And that brings us to the end of our panel discussion. You can still use Slido if you want. Any other questions you're itching to ask or feel that you haven't been able to ask, please ask it through Slido. But we've run out of time, so unfortunately, just as things are heating up, we have to conclude. So please thank our speaker and the panel. Yes, Mr. President. Oh, no, I will turn it back to my partner. So please thank Speaker Art and our discussants, Elmer, Ryan, Mercy, and Architect De Guzman. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. And now I turn the podium back to my partner.
At this point of the program, I'd like to ask for FEF President, Dolly Chiquianco, and the rest of the Board of Trustees. I think Dr. Medalla is here, Attorney Rick Balatbat, Mr. Montes, I think is also here, Mr. Eddie Gana. So we have a family photo with our speakers and panelists, together with the FEF trustees. Okay. Again, a round of applause for our speakers and panelists. So to cap off our event, I'd like to turn the podium over to FEF Board of Trustee Dr. Felipe Medalla for his closing remarks.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the main speaker for giving such a good presentation, and of course the discussants. Also, clearly, given the attendance, this is a very successful event, and it's one of the best ways to pay tribute to two people that we love so much when they are around, and we still love, Don and Francis. So let's get the memory of the two. Now, it's very clear that in the case of land, there are market failures everywhere. Externalities, floods. What you do to your land can affect your neighbor. What you do to your land can affect water supply. What you do to your land can affect traffic. So it's hard to make matters worse. There is lumpiness. By the way, those are the two major sources of market failure in the basic microeconomic textbook: spillover effects and lumpiness. And it's hard to find anything that compares in terms of market failure to the failure of markets in the case of land. But the other side of the economic literature is government failure. And there are many reasons why it could fail. Of course, the biggest reason, of course, is human nature for both. And our speakers have given us a very strong sense of why the inability to coordinate, not use market forces, but coordinate, plan, and enforce, is costing society so much. Of course, the question is, what is the solution? And if resources are scarce, especially the ability to enforce, the ability to do the right things, by the way, that is one of the hardest because it requires integrity and competence. It's hard to find anything scarcer coming together. But still, discussions like this are very important because they show the way. They say, well, how do we, at least an FEF, get together and agree on certain things? Of course, what we know is that the law as it is has good points, but it has bad points. And it seems, including from the present speaker, that sometimes if you're not careful, you try to do too much, you lose focus, you just clutter everything, and maybe make enforcement even more difficult, maybe selling the rules even more lucrative. We have to be a lot more careful. But what's clear is there's no consensus, except that it's not clear whether the current version of the law is better than having nothing. Of course, even clearer though is maybe if we talk more, we can have a better version. And here, of course, I cannot offer my services because I'm not allowed to do part-time work. Yeah. So we, FEF, should make this an important part of our, what do you call what we do, the e-group. And again, thank you to speakers. Thank you to everyone who attended. Considering the traffic, I'm sure you wanna beat it. By the way, there's a window. If I speak 2 minutes longer, you'll be in trouble. So thank you very much. And good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming.
Success is not possible without our partners. So a final thank you to our major sponsors, Aboitiz Power Corporation, Bank of the Philippine Islands, Meralco, and our minor sponsors, Ayala Land Incorporated, Convergence Realty and Development Corporation, DMCI, Development Bank of the Philippines, Friedrich Naumann Foundation Philippines, Manila Water Company, Organization of Socialized Housing Developers of the Philippines, Philippine Veterans Bank, Philippine Chamber of Commerce Incorporated, Pro Friends Group Incorporated, Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation, Stratcom Corporation, Malate Construction and Development Corporation, and Finma Properties Incorporated. So for all the key participants, all presentations are uploaded in the fef.org.philippines website, and if it's not in the card, USB is always there in the website. So thank you everyone for participating. Of course, we know that the land use is a complicated topic and a complicated advocacy. So let's not uncomplicate it, so wine will be served. Thank you and good afternoon.